Welcome to Staying Connected, a podcast where I talk to people about their stories with VEDS, Marfan, Loeys-Dietz, and related vascular and aortic connective tissue conditions. This is your host, Katie, and before we get into the show, I want to remind you that the views, information, and opinions in this podcast are those of the individuals involved, and the information presented does not constitute medical or other professional advice or services. Any opinions that I express in this podcast are my own and not of my employer. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Staying Connected. I have VEDS, and on this show, I talk to other people about their stories with VEDS and similar conditions like Marfan syndrome and Loeys-Dietz. Today, we're going to talk to Maya Brown-Zimmerman, who was diagnosed with Marfan syndrome as a child. Because of her atypical features and medical events, her diagnosis was questioned several times, and she was tested for vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and Loeys-Dietz before a genetic test revealed she does have an FBN1 mutation associated with Marfan syndrome. Before we go over to the interview with Maya, did you know that Staying Connected now reaches people on all 7 continents in 84 different countries? This show continues to spread its reach around the world, and if you want to support it and help it continue to reach people who need to hear it, join my Patreon. For $5 or $10 a month, you can support the production of this show and other content about VEDS, Marfan, and Loeys-Dietz. I've linked the Patreon in the episode show notes, and I just want to give a shout out to my patrons who have already been supporting the show. This podcast means so much to me, and I couldn't do it without your support. So thank you, thank you, thank you. My top tier patrons are listed in the episode show notes. You can also support this show by simply sharing this podcast with people you know. Thank you so much for your support. This show will release every other Saturday through September, so make sure you subscribe on your podcast player so you don't miss any episodes, and stick around at the end of the show for a preview of what's next. Hey Maya, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast and sharing your experience with Marfan syndrome with us. You are my first interviewee with Marfan syndrome, and I really cannot express how much I appreciate you coming on the show. Do you want to introduce yourself to everybody who doesn't know you already?
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. I, like you said, have Marfan syndrome, and I'm a mom of 4 kids. We live in Ohio, and I'm also a genetic counseling graduate student. I'm really active with the Marfan Foundation as an advisor to their professional advisory board and their board of directors. And I used to blog a lot about living with Marfan syndrome.
Yeah, and so for someone who's listening who doesn't know what Marfan syndrome is, but is super familiar with what VEDS is, would you like to define that?
So we're kind of like genetic cousins. Marfan syndrome is a connective tissue disorder of the fibrillin instead of the collagen, so it's a different gene, but it affects the aorta primarily, and the eyes, the lungs, and then kind of the skin and bones. So people with Marfan syndrome tend to be tall and flexible, but not as hypermobile as somebody with, EDS might be. We tend to just have aneurysms within the aorta, lens dislocation, retinal detachment, and lung diseases, and dural ectasia, which is a ballooning of the dura sac around the spinal cord, are really common with us.
Okay. And I know that not everybody with Marfan syndrome has those specific limitations to where the involvement is, right? And we're going to talk about that with your story too. But first, how were you diagnosed with Marfan syndrome? How did that even come about?
It was a very long process, partially just because genetic testing wasn't really around then, but also because my features are kind of atypical. When I was 8, my mom took me to the pediatrician because she felt like I was not developing like other kids my age. I had already had several GI surgeries at that point and spent most of the first 2 years of my life in and out of the hospital. So she went to the pediatrician. She said, I'm not leaving until you figure out what's going on. Maya's really clumsy, and she just doesn't seem like she has the strength to do the activities that the other kids are doing. Plus, she doesn't look like any of us. I was pretty tall at that point, and my parents were not tall. And I won't ever forget, he just stood and stared at us for a few minutes. And then it was like this light bulb went off in his head. And he went and got a tape measure. He didn't say anything. And he just started taking measurements of me. And then he turned to my mom and he said, "I'm so sorry. I should have figured this out before. But I think Maya has something called Marfan syndrome." And then he sent us to the hospital for an echocardiogram. And I ended up meeting with a geneticist later who confirmed at that point the diagnosis of Marfan syndrome clinically.
And that was without genetic testing, right?
That was without genetic testing. That was 30 years ago this summer, I think. And then over the years, many clinicians have brought that diagnosis into question. And so my freshman year of college, I thought I was just transferring care locally, met with a geneticist there who said he didn't think that I had Marfan syndrome. He thought I had VEDS because of my atypical scarring, my translucent skin, really stretchy skin in some places where you can pull and there's like a lot of extra skin, and issues with my femoral artery. So at that point, testing was a skin biopsy. So they did like the cookie cutter skin punch and sent my skin over to Peter Byers' lab where it grew for 3 months till he could test it. And then it was negative for VEDS. And I cried because I wanted a diagnosis. And I was frustrated that it seemed like it was yes, Marfan, no Marfan, might be this, might be that. From there, Loeys-Dietz was discovered. And so I was tested for Loeys-Dietz type 1 and type 2 at 2 different labs because commercial testing wasn't available yet. And that was negative. So we went ahead and did the FBN1 testing at that point, which came back positive for a pathogenic or known change to FBN1 that causes Marfan. So I had the diagnosis. But still, I just had further genetic testing done in January because of my dissections being atypical, just to see if they could find anything else going on. So I think there's still an element of mystery to the diagnosis because I don't really fit the Marfan box exactly, but I definitely have that diagnosis.
Yeah, so you have the FBN1 mutation. So I think it's so interesting. So when you were young, you had a diagnosis of Marfan syndrome, and then you had it taken away, and then had testing for VEDS and Loeys-Dietz, and then you got the testing for FBN1 after those 2 tests.
Yes. And then they ordered testing for the other Loeys-Dietz genes after those were discovered because my father had cleft lip and cleft palate, my brother had clubbed feet, and my niece has tethered cord. And so those are all more Loeys-Dietz, but that was negative. And then, like I said, in January, they did the full 92 gene connective tissue disorder panel to see if anything else came up.
Yeah. So let's talk about, I want to touch on a little bit, you mentioned the GI surgeries you had, you mentioned problems with your femoral artery, and of course, dissections that you've had recently. So let's talk a little bit about those more. So what were your GI surgeries when you were growing up?
So first was that there was a congenital diaphragmatic hernia, although ultrasound in the 80s was not great. So that wasn't picked up until I was a few months old and was vomiting blood. And then they did imaging and were like, oh, crap. So they did a repair for that. But I developed intestinal adhesions multiple times and had to have multiple bowel resection surgeries as a result, just because I don't heal the way that I should, not internally and not externally. So I have a lot of keloided scarring from that surgery. And then the femoral artery surgery was for a radiofrequency ablation for SVT, but I developed multiple pseudoaneurysms throughout the femoral artery. And unfortunately, my doctor didn't take my symptoms seriously until my leg turned black and swelled up and I couldn't move it anymore and I almost lost it. And then they did ultrasound, found that I needed to have a couple of procedures to fix that.
When was that? How old were you?
I was 18. The surgery was done the day before my 18th birthday. And they did a procedure about a week after, and then again a month after I had a surgery to close more of the pseudoaneurysms. So I still have some nerve damage in that leg just from all of the bleeding and swelling. And then in August 1st of this summer, so 2022, I had a spontaneous coronary artery dissection the week we moved to our new home, just before I started grad school. And then while I was in the hospital with the SCAD, I had a vertebral artery dissection, which they didn't catch until I had like imaging a few weeks later. And then we found a second vertebral artery dissection last week when I was doing some imaging to see if the original dissections had healed. The SCAD did. The vertebral artery dissection, I think, is going to be chronic. So now I have had 3 dissections in a short amount of time.
Yeah.
But not ones that you typically see with Marfan syndrome.
Right. Because I think when I first heard about Marfan syndrome as somebody with VEDS, what I learned was that for Marfan syndrome, that aortic involvement is really pronounced, but not so much the other arteries. And so I'm interested, like, with your symptoms of Marfan that are so outside of that, it's like an outlier maybe, or maybe there's, more types of Marfan syndrome that we don't know about yet, right? But, what has it been like having the VEDS community kind of become more involved in the Marfan community with these kind of overlapping experiences?
I think it's so helpful. I had friends from the VEDS community reach out to me after my dissections and offer connections, offer advice. And I just really appreciated there were other people there that knew what I was going through and could help me find appropriate care, because locally, some of the doctors are great, but they also hadn't really seen that before. And so some of the information I got originally was not correct, which I think a lot of people with VEDS and Marfan and similar disorders can relate to.
Yeah.
And kind of being a zebra within a zebra, just having a couple people with Marfan that I'd found that had these dissections, I really appreciated the VEDS community.
Yeah. Well, we really appreciate being part of this too. And I personally really appreciate getting these closer connections with people who have similar conditions as well to vascular EDS. I want to go back because we very briefly talked about, your diagnosis, but what did all of that feel like? Are you the first one in your family? Like, were you, it sounds like a pretty traumatic event that happened in high school with your leg and the femoral, and I'm guessing that's from the access point for the surgery.
Right.
What were all of your emotions going through this? What were you told when you were diagnosed with Marfan syndrome about your life?
So what my understanding from conversations that my parents had with some of the professionals when I was diagnosed was that the life expectancy at that point was in the 40s, and that I would not and should not have kids. So I felt like I was kind of being talked at instead of talked to, and saw that my parents were very stressed out about this diagnosis. They didn't want me to tell family. They didn't want me to tell friends. And there was a lot of worry. So my parents trying to kind of keep me in a bubble, which I really rejected. But then also feeling stressed because I knew I wasn't like my peers. And there were definitely periods of time growing up where it was more important to be like everybody else than maybe it is now as an adult. And, being left out of things. And I definitely had some great friends that tried to be very inclusive, which I appreciated, but worried about the future and what that was going to be like, especially if nobody could tell me for sure what my diagnosis was.
Yeah.
And it was kind of hard to do planning for the future without knowing. So I just kind of decided I was going to do what I was going to do, because how much can any of us really know what's going to happen? And try to just live my life that way.
Yeah. And that's it's got to be so, it just sounds like such a roller coaster too, with just not knowing and knowing and then not knowing and then having all of these things and then, landing at this place where you're just like, well, I'm going to do whatever I want.
It was frustrating. There were times it was scary. I think I was more frustrated than anything else because I wanted an answer. And I lost friends over the years. At 13, I got involved with the local Marfan syndrome group, and I made a really close friend, and she died of dissection shortly after we met. And her parents knew that she was dissecting, but couldn't get appropriate care from the professionals at the hospital. And so that's been something that has really driven the advocacy work that I've done. But anytime I'm in the hospital, it's on the forefront, because you can be as a great an advocate as possible, but you can't make the hospital do what they need to do. So that's definitely something that's been on my mind over the years as well.
Yeah. And that's very, very relatable to me. And I think a lot of people in the VEDS community too. There's this like, on one hand, if you go, there's obviously been something that has worked to me, like for me, the way that I see it, there's obviously been something that over time, there is a greater awareness of Marfan syndrome in the emergency rooms, although I don't think that is probably every emergency room. But there have been people that I know that if they go to the ER and say, hey, I have VEDS, it's like Marfan syndrome, sometimes they actually know what that means. And that is just, it's kind of like standing on the shoulders of giants, like the history of everything that the Marfan community has done, in my mind, is helping also for VEDS. And hopefully over time, people are like, oh yeah, I have this, it's like VEDS, and they know what that means too. But I think it's a very similar challenge that we experience in the emergency room specifically. It's not a foreign story, and it's so heartbreaking to know that that's like, it's heartbreaking to know that your friend went through that when you were 13. And I'm sorry that you lost your friend.
Thank you.
Yeah. So you touched on wanting to, let's talk about advocacy. So you said at 13, after that happened, that's when you started really getting involved?
Yes. Before that, I said I was just angry a lot. And I kind of pushed boundaries with school and phys ed and trying to see what I could get away with. But I decided, with the 13-year-old point of view, that I was going to educate myself, and then I was going to educate doctors, and then nobody else would die from a dissection because we would just have educated everybody. So I wrote an article about the new autopathy clinic that was starting for the local newspaper, did some things with the news, and got involved with the Marfan Foundation, kind of doing like peer-to-peer mentoring through a physical mailing list that they had. And, kind of grew from there. So I got invited to speak at different medical schools or grand rounds presentations. I worked with Ben Wiseman to run the teen program for the foundation for about 10 years. I'm with Lou Arias too, and have kind of built on that through my blog or other connections that I've made.
And what has that experience been like for you?
Every time that I get to speak in front of medical professionals, I feel like I have to pinch myself that I'm fulfilling the promise that I made to myself as a teenager, because I'm hoping that they will remember at least some of what we've talked about, and that then in the ER or in their practice, that they'll be on the lookout for signs for not only Marfan, but we talk about the related conditions as well. Mm-hmm. And I got to be an author on the new aortic disease guidelines that came out in November. And one of the coolest things ever. I mean, I'm glad that I'm able to contribute to the community in a way that's going to help make things better.
Yeah. And you have done so much. Like, I've seen your name all over the place, and it's really, really awesome to see just how much you've done in the last 25 or so years since your own diagnosis, or since you got involved as a teenager. Do you want to talk about building a family, what that's been like for you? Because as you said, you were told not to, but I know that you have one.
So as I got older and learned more about like more recent research and things, my nurse practitioner that I worked with, and I decided that it would be safe for me. Well, I mean, I'd be high risk, but definitely safer than what I had been told if I wanted to go ahead and have a family. And so I met with maternal fetal medicine specialist and genetics, and cardiology and neurology to look at my dural ectasia, and like went through all the specialists to get everybody to sign off and kind of put together a plan for what pregnancy would look like. And I remember kind of keeping my mom informed along the way. And I had been told I should have kids early. So I had my first son just before I turned 24. But I remember calling my mom to tell her I was pregnant, and she was silent. And I said, "Are you going to say anything?" And she said, "You make it sound like I should be happy about this." And my mom and I were really close. I said, "Well, yeah, it's good news." She said, "No, this is awful news. This is, I didn't think you were actually going to go through with this." And she was terrified the entire pregnancy that I was going to dissect. And we did not talk about the baby again until I was in my third trimester. And I mean, she was very excited when he was born, and that, I mean, there were some complications, but like overall things were okay. She handled it a little bit better when I got pregnant the second time, but that pregnancy was much more difficult. And after my second son was born, my cardiologist said no more. Mm-hmm. And so we ended up adopting 2 little girls, a little while after.
Yeah. So you have 4 kids.
4 kids. It's a very busy house.
It sounds like a very busy house. What kind of complications did you have with those pregnancies? Any?
With Miles, my oldest, I developed very high blood pressure during delivery. They had wanted me sedated for delivery. Just the anesthesiologist didn't feel comfortable doing an epidural with my dural ectasia. And we think that it was preeclampsia, but we're not totally sure. So when I woke up, I was in the telemetry unit and Miles was in the NICU. And that was very stressful. I felt like I didn't know what was going on. I was kind of in and out of it. I wanted my kid. I didn't know where he was. That was really hard. And I had high blood pressure for 3 months afterwards that they had trouble controlling. And then it stopped and my blood pressure went back to normal. So when I got pregnant with Julian, we were living in a different part of the country. And that doctor put me on baby aspirin for the whole pregnancy to try to prevent preeclampsia, if that's what happened. With Julian, I started having contractions like 25 weeks. They weren't productive, but there were amniotic fluid issues too. So I was kind of on partial bed rest for the last 2 months of pregnancy. And then I developed lymphedema after delivery, which we're not really sure why that happened, but I mean, that's a permanent thing.
Yeah. Can you describe what lymphedema is for those that don't know?
So it's like the lymph nodes in part of my body basically died, I guess. And so I retain a lot of fluid in both of my legs. And so I wear compression stockings to kind of prevent it from getting worse. And I have like a machine that does massage of like from my waist down to massage the lymph nodes that are there and get them to work as well as they can.
Yeah. So did they have you do with VEDS, a lot of people who go through pregnancy, like they're told to get like an early C-section and not go through the actual delivery. Is that the same or similar for Marfan syndrome, or did you go full term?
I think it depends on your aortic size and the rate of growth. So for my boys, they had said we could go full term. I think they scheduled the C-section for Julian at 39, or for Miles at 39 weeks. And then we were going to try for a VBAC with Julian, which my cardiologist was on board with. The maternal fetal medicine specialist was very unhappy with that plan. But I've had so many surgeries like on my abdomen that I really wanted to try to prevent another one, because delivering is trauma, but so is surgery. And so it's kind of like pick your poison, balance the risks. And we felt like C-section would be riskier. But when they induced me, when the fluid was too low and he was having trouble, so they tried induction. And when he continued to have trouble, we had to do an emergency C-section. The recovery for that was easier than the C-section where I was under general anesthesia, though. So I'm glad that it went okay. But they said my uterus was very, very thin and that the doctor who delivered me was concerned it could have ruptured if I had gone through with delivery. So like it worked out in the end that we did the C-section.
Yeah, and that sounds very familiar too, as well. It's so, I love talking to you because I think there's so many overlaps in the experiences here. And it's like, I mean, I personally, to make it clear, I have not gone through pregnancy, but I've known of people with VEDS who've gone through pregnancy who've been told that there's one interview I did with Meg where, when they went into the C-section, they could see the baby's hair through the uterus. Like it was that then.
Yeah. And again, not something that you typically worry about with Marfan patients, which is why my doctor was okay with doing the VBAC. But yeah, that's what happened. So
yeah, thank you for sharing that with me. You said you're in school for genetic counseling.
Yeah.
So at what point in your advocacy journey did you move from like all of this like blogging and medical education and speaking to doctors and things to I want to be in the medical field? Like when did that switch happen for you?
Actually, I wanted to be a genetic counselor since high school. My junior year English teacher brought it up to me when we were planning for career day. She's like, I don't know if you've heard of this career, but I think that you would be really good at it. And as she was describing it to me, I'm like, oh, I've met with one before. So I shadowed at the local hospital where I am now going to be rotating and have rotated in the past as part of my program. And the geneticist who diagnosed me is the co-director of my graduate program, which I didn't realize until I matched.
That's awesome.
But it's a very small world. When I went to college, like stuff happened. And so I went on a different plan, like into public health and thinking that I would do advocacy work through public health. But I never forgot about the genetic counseling. And in 2019, I went to the NORD conference the first one that they put together with patients and families and medical professionals and drug companies. And I was speaking for a couple different workshops there, but then networking with these families who, some of them, their disorders are so rare. They're like 1 of 5 or the only one. And talking with the genetic counselors there, and I just realized this is where I wanted to be. So I came home and talked with Mark, my husband, and started classes like a month later at the community college to take the prerequisites I would need before applying to genetic counseling programs.
That is awesome. So now how far are you, like when are you officially a genetic counselor? Like how close are you?
I'm halfway done. I will graduate in May of 2024, but I will be looking for jobs starting in the next few months. I guess the job search kind of starts in October. So it's really neat to be done with the first year. I'm very proud of myself because, like I said, I dissected like a week and a half before classes started. So it was not the start to grad school that I was hoping for, but you just roll with it. And I love the rotations that we're doing, working in the different clinics. I love the coursework. I love my classmates. Like I feel very much this is where I'm supposed to be at the time that I'm supposed to be there.
That's wonderful. Now, that was your spontaneous coronary artery dissection?
Yeah.
Do you want to talk more about what that was like?
Sure. It's about 10 o'clock at night and I was in bed reading a book and all of a sudden I started to have chest discomfort. It's like a burning kind of pressure. If you've had costochondritis, then you might know what I'm talking about. And that's what I thought it was at first. And costochondritis is like a harmless inflammation of the muscles in the chest wall. I get that pretty frequently. But it got worse pretty quickly. And then I noticed it had spread down both of my arms. And I felt a lot of pain in my thumbs, which is weird. But like somebody was pushing down really hard on my thumbs. And then I felt the pain in my jaw. And I thought, oh, if I'm having jaw pain, then this is a heart attack. But I don't know why I'd be having a heart attack because I'm 37 and healthy. So maybe I'm dissecting, and my aorta is enlarged, but it wasn't at dissection point. So I was like arguing with myself. I went downstairs and got my husband. I said, I'm having really bad pain, but it can't really be a dissection. So let's just hang out for a little bit. Maybe I'll take a shower, take some Motrin, and like see if the pain goes away. And then I got to the point I couldn't stand anymore. And he said, I'm calling an ambulance. And so I put on some clothes, I guess, and went to wait. And my second child was awake, and he has Marfan syndrome too. So that was very traumatic to have the ambulance taking me away with him awake and seeing that was happening. And they were going to discharge me from the ER, but luckily they waited and got my second round of troponin levels back with the blood work. And then they saw that they were jumping up, and they were like, okay, there's something wrong with your heart. We need to admit you. And they did a cath the next day, an angiogram through my arm. And that's when they found the dissection.
So when you got to the ER, I'm trying to put myself in your shoes here. So you have Marfan syndrome. You go to the ER. You tell them you have Marfan syndrome and that you're having this like major, at least significant chest pain, right? And they didn't do like a CTA or an echo to see if there was an aortic dissection?
They did do a CT.
Okay.
And I don't know why the SCAD didn't show on the CT.
Got it. Okay.
Like that is, to this day, very confusing to me because I've done CTAs since then to like check on it.
Yeah.
But no, when the EMT showed up, I said, okay, you're going to do it in EKG. You're going to see that I'm having a heart attack, but my EKG always looks like I'm having a heart attack. So you have to like compare it to my other ones, which they didn't have because I had just moved there. So they said, no, you're having a heart attack. And they wouldn't take me to the university hospital. They took me to the community hospital because it was closer. And I could barely breathe at this point. So I like wasn't in a place to argue with them. But they gave me nitro and aspirin to treat for a heart attack. And I did say, I'm a little worried that if I'm dissecting, that this would be a problem. But I also understand where they were coming from with that. They did the CTA, and then I just was in the ER for hour. I mean, it was the next morning when they brought me upstairs, but they're like, well, your numbers aren't high enough that it looks like a classic heart attack. We don't really know what to do with you. I'm glad that they went through with the angiogram, which I was nervous about because of the femoral artery issues.
Right, because you'd already had issues before at an insertion site for a catheter.
Right. And so they said that the risk of that was much lower with the arm, but that they would, monitor and things. So I'm glad that they caught it, but they discharged me the next day, even though by that point I was having the vertebral artery dissection and was puking from the pain because they said I would be fine in a week. That it just would take 1 to 2 weeks to heal, and then I would be good as new.
And that's obviously not what happened.
Which is not, it's just not the case for SCADs. Like in general, it takes about 3 months to heal. And I did cardiac rehab, and you're so tired after. I mean, I slept so much. I don't remember a lot from the first month or two after dissection because it was physically painful to be awake, which I was not expecting.
And that was how you started school.
Yeah. So I did part of orientation. I would go to orientation in the morning, and then I would do the second part of orientation virtually. And then I would go to class in person, but we had a late Wednesday class, at 3:00 in the afternoons. I would do that virtually from bed. But I did half days for my rotations for the first couple of months, which I was glad that my program director suggested, because when I met with her, I was like, well, they said I'll be fine in a couple of weeks. So I'm glad that she pushed me to go a little more slowly.
That's really good to have that kind of support.
I was very grateful for it, but I got my homework in on time and, was able to, then I got COVID. So that kind of threw a wrench in things too, a few weeks after the dissections. But overall, we got it done. There was a lot of support from the Marfan and VEDS and Loeys-Dietz communities, which I really appreciated.
Yeah. I'm so glad that you made it through that first year. With everything that's going on, That is amazing. Good congratulations. I'm not going to clap on a podcast because it might be really disruptive, but really, like, that is really incredible that you went through with it and continued to go to school and do all of those things. Like, and here you are halfway through your genetic counseling school and almost at the end of it, really. It's very exciting.
I feel very lucky to have come through the dissections okay, and then to be able to do this and to have support from family and friends. And
yeah. So I want to ask you a couple, like, kind of parting thoughts. You have been involved in the Marfan community for a while, and you mentioned, like, all of your involvement with the teen group with Ben Wiseman over the years. If there's somebody listening to this podcast or listening to your story who is a teenager with Marfan or VEDS or Loeys-Dietz, or is just newly diagnosed with Marfan or is going through that whole diagnostic odyssey, what kind of advice would you give them?
I think the most valuable thing for me has been to connect with the community, to know that I'm not alone. There are other people that are going through similar things, whether they have my exact diagnosis or not. He said there's a lot of overlap, but just becoming friends with people who understand the different sort of life we lead. And I saw so many examples as a teen of people who were living well with this condition. And my parents were very nervous about having me involved because of the possibility for loss and trauma. And that's true. I've lost a lot of friends over the years. And I've, seen friends go through really difficult things, and I've gone through difficult things. But the value that these friendships have had outweighs the scary and the hard parts. And I would want parents who are unaffected to understand that I think there's really nothing more valuable than your kids connecting with adults and peers who are like them.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic advice. Truly. I think that's been one of the things that has helped me the most too. And, if you're listening to this and you are looking for ways to meet others or get involved, there's a list of ways to get involved in the episode show notes. So I really encourage you to peek down there for information and, reach out if you need help too. What would you want a medical professional to know about Marfan, given your story?
One, that variable expression is a real thing. And so, there's the textbook, like, case of this is what Marfan syndrome is. And some people fit into that, but a lot of people don't. They think of us as being thin. A lot of adults with Marfan syndrome are overweight, or we have these unusual dissections, or aren't necessarily tall. But to also not just assume that because somebody meets clinical criteria that they have Marfan, like, to go through with genetic testing and confirm that that's what it is and that it's not VEDS or Loeys-Dietz or one of these other conditions. And then to understand that although on paper, like, we have an average life expectancy, it doesn't mean that it's easy to have this diagnosis, that there is still loss and trauma that we're dealing with, and just to be sensitive to that and help us navigate it, in ways that a medical professional can't, with connecting with resources and things.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important message too, especially, like, as learning about Marfan syndrome myself, like, I heard about how the, like, average life expectancy for Marfan syndrome has gone way up, but that doesn't take away the fact that there are people who pass away from Marfan syndrome from an aortic dissection or some other kind of involvement in the body, or, they pass away early. And there's all these other things too that I've heard you talk about, like pain and derolactasia and all of these other things that still don't make it an easy thing to deal with.
We're living longer, which is amazing, but I want us to be able to live better too. Mm-hmm. And so that's going to require research and teamwork with medical professionals to help us navigate life after dissection, or life with emphysema, or life with chronic pain, and be able to move forward there. And I think that the research that is happening is going to help, our genetic cousins with related conditions, it's an exciting time in that there's a lot of research happening, and I think a lot of really good things are on the horizon.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great kind of parting note there, is just the excitement of the future and how future change could make it a better quality of life too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on to the show, Maya.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Staying Connected, featuring Maya Brown-Zimmerman, who has Marfan syndrome. The next episode of this season on July 29th features Michaela Tingley, whose brother David had VEDS or vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome.
So David got to be with us for 24 years. Initially for us, that was obviously a very sad thing. 24 is a very short life, but we try to focus on the 24 years that we got to have with him. He lived a very normal life. He lived life very carelessly and freely. He was kind of a free spirit through his whole life. And I think that was a special thing about him. He never let anything hold him back, even though as I share his story, you'll learn that we didn't know anything about VEDS while he was here living with us. And he could have very well let a lot of his, we'll call them disabilities and disadvantages against him hold him back, and he never did. And I just think that that's something so special, and that we should all be able to live that way, carefree and carelessly sometimes.
Don't miss this episode on July 29th with Michaela Tingley. I am so grateful for her coming on and sharing her brother's story with VEDS. I don't have a big list of events for you today, as the VEDS camp was just last weekend, and the Marfan Foundation conference is happening right now in Chicago. If you want to meet me, I'm here. Come find me. I would love to meet you. Don't forget to subscribe to Staying Connected on your podcast player so you don't miss any future episodes. And if you like this show, I hope you will consider sharing it with your friends on social media to raise awareness of these conditions. You can also support the production of this podcast by joining my Patreon. Thanks so much, and I will see you soon.